I just thought that was interesting because you made a comment a couple of days ago or weeks ago about like, since we've been doing kind of our work and getting out of enemy mode and attachment and all the wilder stuff, like you're more kind of mindful for certain things and certain feelings, but you've also had an uptick in nightmares and night terrors too. So that made a lot of sense to me, like that your brain's maybe still processing at night. So I thought that was interesting. Um, but let's kind of continue down this down this path.
So let's talk about situations that have a tendency to create chronic dysregulation. It can be anything from trauma to marriage challenges to parent challenges, obviously neurodiversity, codependency, lack. What are the situations? What's common? What have you seen that create this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So on a kind of a baseline, it's somewhere some need that feels vital isn't getting met. So anybody with a history of trauma or disrupted relationships growing up or abuse or whatnot, that's going to predispose somebody to have a more vulnerable nervous system that's going to dysregulate faster. We've already talked about neurodiversity, whether it's the individual might have a brain that's a little bit more sensitive to the environment, to other people, but then, the family around them can become more prone to dysregulation as we're trying to prevent a meltdown, or we're worried about what might happen if we take our child out in public, or so there can become sort of this hypervigilance that develops around not wanting dysregulation. And then the other really area where it can show up, especially that's relevant to your work, is in marriage, where someone is chronically not getting their emotional needs met. They're being invalidated. They're not feeling heard. They're feeling abandoned. When they have needs, those are discounted or aren't being listened to. And or often that goes along with a personality that's then going to try to solve it by overfunctioning and being as perfect as possible and people pleasing. And that puts their system in overdrive. That's not sustainable all of the time, and it's not healthy. And so that's going to wear down their resilience as well. And then, simple physical things like lack of sleep or lack of time alone. So oftentimes these issues will really show up when people start to have children, because the higher need demand can't be met somehow by the couple with what's going on. And so one person isn't sleeping enough or is always on duty and isn't getting enough relief with the children. And then that can also begin to wear them out.
And that can be true whether you recognize the situation or not. You don't have to be conscious of some type of hurt or harm for your nervous system to put you in a regular dysregulated state.
Absolutely. In fact, it all happens unconsciously because the protective part of the brain happens very quickly and reactively before our thinking brain even comes online. So we begin to process it as and after it's happening, but we aren't aware often, this thing was the thing that set me off. But we do begin to make connections over time, and then we might operate in an avoidance to those things, whether or not we're correct that that's the actual problem.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of myself two very distinct times I've had chronic illness. The first time centered more around our daughter who was on the spectrum when she was acting out, and we were calling it acting out before we knew it was autism, and eloping or escaping. And so as a parent, then I was constantly on hyper alert of when we get out, where are the exits? Where could she go? Where could she hide? What noises could be a thing? And so I started becoming just as hyper vigilant to the noises because, that's going to stress her out. So I was like pre-stressed for her. And then we didn't know about our neurodiversity and our relationship. So our relationship was not going that great. So there wasn't like active abuse or something of Dan to me, but there wasn't that emotional connection. And there was what was going on with Sydney. And as I was learning more about autism and kind of becoming more aware and more hyper vigilant to her, I was more in hyper arousal at that state and would get chronic fatigue and migraines. And then kind of fast forward to a couple of years ago, Dan and I's marriage has been in the best place ever, but we sustained trauma. Well, it's traumatic for me, not traumatic for Dan, where a tree landed on our house. And then we had to move 9 times around Metro Atlanta. Another tree fell, and then a third tree fell on our vehicles. And so we had no transportation. All of our belongings were in storage somewhere, that survived. And then we were constantly moving, and it was house scarcity during, COVID-19. And we were just pushing through. I mean, there was no kind of consciousness about how terrible this is. Like, we just had to do it. We both still had jobs. If the insurance company said you're moving in 2 days, you packed up and you moved and you got settled in the new place. And if they said you're packing up and moving, I mean, you just did it. But that took turns. Who was going to call State Farm today? Because we have 4 claims now at this point. And we just did that for 21 months. And then, like, once we got back in the house and things were settled, it was like my complete body fell apart. I went back into chronic fatigue. I have autoimmune diseases and all the stuff that I'm working through, nutrition and all of that. So it wasn't relational at all, but it was, 21 months of just sustained stress that didn't affect in the same space at all. There's like a problem to solve. Okay, we're just going to pack up the thing. We're going to get the thing. I'll call and you call. But I think for me, because your home is such security and safety for you, and to not know, like, where am I going to sleep next? Or we don't have a car. However, we were a 2-car family. Now we're borrowing someone else's car. And me, like, I don't want to wreck somebody's brand new vehicle because this person had just gotten their vehicle and they were loaning it to us. So, like, the stress of that, I felt like pressure. And so for 21 months, I was not even checking in on myself. And people would say, Stephanie, how are you doing that? Like, you're still working, you're still doing a podcast, you're still writing. And I was like, I don't know. I must have been running off adrenaline because I killed my adrenal glands. They were flat. And so I think, as I'm kind of thinking of those 2 major things for me, one was hyperarousal, and one is like, oh yeah, there's the identified stress, and that's why it happened. And then this other was just a prolonged stressful situation. There's nothing we could do about it. And again, our relationship was good. We were in teamwork, but the situation in general, being prolonged for 21 months, was difficult for my immune system too. And so now I'm kind of doing some of the things that I'm sure you're going to tell our clients about, but I know I was in a constant fight, flight, overwhelmed state over those 21 months and just wasn't dealing with it. Like, you get up the next day and you do it again. So talk us into, like, the fight, flight, freeze. Now we have fawn, overwhelm. How does that manifest in the dysregulated nervous system? And what happens when you're in that chronic state for weeks, months, years?
Well, yeah. First, I thank you for bringing up sort of the non-relationship stressors and normalizing that, because it doesn't, we can't blame everything on marriage or whatever. It's how we're wired, how we personally respond to stress. And then it's all the factors. It's not usually one thing or another thing. It's more of a combination that pushes our nervous system past its ability to cope or to bounce back. So before we talk about the fight, flight, or freeze, I just want to pause for a second and say, dysregulation isn't bad. I feel like it's gotten a bad reputation, right? We see dysregulation as the wrong thing that's happening. If our child dysregulates or we dysregulate, there's even shame around that, right? We don't want it to happen. We want to prevent it. If we see it happen in ourselves, we do not feel good about ourselves, and we want to prevent it next time, right? So I think it's critical to help ourselves understand and have compassion for ourselves. God created our nervous system to respond with dysregulation to protect us. It's how it sounds the alarm to get our attention that something's not okay. And sometimes it does that inappropriately about things that aren't really a threat because it makes an incorrect assessment. But really, that system is very important for our safety. And it's the thing that drives a woman to say, we need counseling, or I might need some space because this relationship isn't safe. And we want her nervous system to sound that alarm so that movement and change happens. So that's appropriate. But for a lot of us, the ideal is when we move into dysregulation, then we come back into regulation after whatever the event is. And if it's either prolonged or we don't know how to move back into regulation, that's when it becomes a problem. And we start seeing people end up with that low-level baseline of stress and dysregulation that leads to the symptoms and the illnesses. So let's talk about the different types of nervous system states. So stress can feel like the stereotypical experience of fight or flight that we're most familiar with and that we think of when we think of stress. So that's either feeling anxious or rushed or pressured, or that we're kind of revved up and running on adrenaline. Or it's the butterflies in your stomach and the sweaty palms before you give a presentation. It's that rush of stress chemistry when you're late to an appointment. But it can manifest in other ways as well. And that first way, it's more classic. It's what we're more familiar with. And sometimes it feels good even, right? It's this really great motivation that helps fuel you to keep going in the face of stress. And that's what I was running on when my kids were really little and they were waking up every 45 minutes. You just get up the next day and do it again because you don't have a choice. And so we do sometimes need those functions to keep going through a difficult time, but we can't live there forever. So oftentimes when the stress is ongoing and it continues to be prolonged, we'll move into the freeze response. So this is kind of the anecdotal going limp or playing dead in the animal world. The hope is either that we're going to fly under the radar and avoid attack, or that the body's shutting down and going numb to protect against the full experience of pain, when the lion bites or whatever. So when our nervous system goes into freeze, it has basically determined we're in danger, we're going to keep getting hurt. So it's doing what it can to minimize the impact. So an example might be if we're in a difficult relationship, there's that ongoing rupture and lack of repair, our nervous system will eventually protect us by going numb to some degree. It can't do that over functioning anymore, so it sort of gives up. And that's in that state is where we're going to experience things like brain fog, lethargy, chronic fatigue, lack of motivation, and a flat affect. So you might find you can't laugh at something funny, you can't cry at a funeral, and you can't access joy. And then the more lesser known state is called fawn or overwhelm. And in this state, we're bouncing back and forth between fight or flight and freeze. This is the state where we're running around trying to make sure everyone else is okay so that we can be okay. This is where we see more of the codependency dynamics. We're measuring our level of safety based on the responses of the people around us. And so if other people are happy, then we feel safe. If they aren't happy or they aren't responding to our bids for connection, we work harder and try to fix it. And I think this is where a lot of women, neurotypicals married to neurodiverse men, live much of their lives. And it's where we find ourselves over-functioning and overworking to try to get our needs met and to feel secure. But the fact is, living in this way isn't sustainable either. It's kind of a crazy cycle because it never really creates safety, and it leaves us vulnerable to developing those chronic illnesses, anxiety, depression. Essentially, it's giving away our power.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about being dysregulated. How do we undo this? What is nervous system repair, nervous system health? And is it ever too late? Can I be so broken that, you know what? Might as well just not try.
Great question, Dan. No, it's never too late because the brain is malleable through our entire lifetime. And I've seen people go from bedbound and needing a caretaker full time to being able to re-engage in life. So it's very powerful to work with the nervous system to learn regulation. And almost anybody is capable of that. They just have to be willing. So while we can't control the variables that set up our vulnerability to dysregulation, such as our neurotype or our past, we can always learn skills to increase our resilience and increase our window of tolerance to the stressors around us. So there are a lot of tools that help us move out of chronic low-level dysregulation so we can feel better and be less impacted by that. And I'm happy to give some examples.
Yeah, so I'd like an example.
Yeah, and I want to put in a disclaimer because sometimes I hear from the neurodivergent person, well, what I just heard Jana say is because I'm neurodivergent, I'm more likely to be dysregulated. So it sounds like the family's just going to have to deal with my dysregulation. But I'm going to be an equal offender and say to the neurotypical wife who might say, well, I'm under trauma and I'm having a traumatic reactive response. And that's why I'm dysregulated. And I wouldn't act this way if you wouldn't act this way. And so I think it's important, no matter what your neurotype is, and no matter if it is trauma or because your amygdala actually is larger, like each person's got to be responsible for coming out of enemy mode, and each person's got to do their work to regulate their nervous system. Like if we've been stuck in this negative cycle where the brains are just tripping each other and one person's dysregulation gets the other person dysregulated, which dysregulates the other person, and we just kind of stay in that spot. So we're all overwhelmed until we do it again. Like this cycle needs to stop. And so your neurotype doesn't give you a pass, neurotypical or neurodivergent, not to do your own work. So I was kind of thinking through, I was like, I could see someone saying, oh, well, I'm autistic, so I just get to stay dysregulated because that's just how my brain works. Or, oh, I've had trauma. So I've had PTSD. I just get to stay dysregulated. So take us through these very practical things that could help people regulate their nervous system.
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to respond to that. I would actually argue that the more you are vulnerable to dysregulation, the higher your responsibility is to work on this. Because not only for the people around you, but for yourself, if you are choosing to say, I'm just going to be dysregulated, that's the way that I am, your body is going to pay a price for that. And yes, often women are more vulnerable, and I don't think we know exactly why, but they come in through the door in much higher numbers with things like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And it may be somewhat due to the hormones that are in our bodies. But even still, with men who are dysregulating, eventually that's going to catch up in some way, shape, or form. And so for your own self, out of care for your body and your mental and emotional well-being, you're the primary beneficiary of doing this work. And if we just blame somebody else, well, I'm traumatized, I'm whatever, then we're choosing to live in victim mode. And there are so many ways you can empower yourself to be healthy and to thrive, regardless of your situation, even if that means setting boundaries, that it's kind of sad to think of just giving up and saying, well, it's their fault, when there actually is something that we can do. It doesn't mean we can fix everything, and it doesn't mean we're responsible for mistreatment. That we are the ones who have to live in our own bodies. And it feels so much better to live in a regulated body than a dysregulated body. So there's quite an invitation there for anybody. Yeah. So before we talk about actual tools, I just want to touch briefly on knowledge versus experience. So many of us love to learn about the brain. We can look at neuroscience. We can geek out on polyvagal theory. We can listen to lots of podcasts and watch YouTube videos and still live in a largely dysregulated state. So it's important to know that rewiring and changing the way that our nervous system is operating is experiential. And this was hard for me at first because I'm a very type A learner researcher. That's my wiring. And so I would rather read about it than do it. But unlike any other thing that I had tried to achieve in my life, this did not come about through working harder and learning more. It was just by doing it every day. So there's no shortcut, and knowledge will not change the nervous system. It's practice and repetition.
And Wilder would support that, right? The more that we just keep reading and researching, we're acquiring knowledge and we're building the left hemisphere of our brain, but we're not doing anything to connect our brain together or to connect it to a relational or experiential thing. And in enemy mode, we know that orbital prefrontal cortex and that amygdala circuit, this is the exact circuit we want to work on for our identity, for joy building, for relationship building. But we have to there is no new learning that can occur if your central nervous system is not regulated. We don't learn if we're in survival, fight, or flight mode. We need to be in a more regulated state to actually learn, but then we have to actually try it. We just can't say, that sounds good in practice if I do some box breathing 3 times a day. Okay, I'll note that. And then say, well, have you tried your box breathing? It doesn't work. Have you tried it? Well, oh, no, I didn't do it, but I just don't think it's going to work for me. It's got to be experiential and tried.
Definitely. Well, and the interesting thing is, when we acquire more knowledge, that actually gives our brain a dopamine hit. So it can feel like we're doing something and it feels good, but it's not changing the whole state of our nervous system. It's just giving us that temporary positive hit, right? So yes. And the other thing that's interesting about this too is you can't just try box breathing 3 times and go, it didn't work, because it takes more than 3 times to change the brain. It took oftentimes years and multiple factors to get it where it is. And the brain's a little bit stubborn. It doesn't want to change overnight, which is good. When we have a healthy brain, we don't want it to be able to change with every wind that comes by. But the downside of that is when it's stuck in a not so good place, it takes a lot of work to get it out of that place. And, maybe as technology and things come along, there will be faster shortcuts. But right now, it does take practice and intentionality. So let's walk through a brief experiential example that helps cultivate nervous system balance. The first step is just to pause get still and quiet. We don't know what we don't know about what's going on. So just like my experience in college, I wasn't connected to myself enough to know I was under stress or to be able to discern what that was. I didn't have that kind of relationship with my nervous system where I could check in. And that's something that also can be developed over time as we learn and practice. So it begins with practicing and developing that habit of stopping to observe and check in like you would with a really good friend, not just how are you, fine, not that kind of a check-in with our body, but no, really, how are you? So place a hand over your heart right now and go ahead and close your eyes and just check in with yourself and just notice. Usually we'll notice the thoughts first, the to-do list, what we're going to have for dinner tonight. And then as we sit with it a little longer and take some time with it, we might start to notice the layer underneath the thoughts. Are we overwhelmed? Is there anything we're worried about? Are we even feeling it all? Or are we kind of numb? And now this is the step where we're potentially tempted to judge ourselves. If I'm feeling anxious, well, maybe I should stop it and trust God more. Or am I tired? I really should be good about going to bed earlier. This doesn't create safety for the nervous system. It actually puts more pressure on us, driving home the lie, it's all up to me and I need to work harder. So when we're doing these kinds of check-ins, we want to set that aside instead. Take a few deep breaths, observe and self-witness with kindness and non-judgment. So I'll just pause for a moment and allow space for that. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes now. And of course, if you're on your own, you can take a little longer. But let's take this a step further. So cross your hands over your collarbones. And if you're just listening and you can't see, it's kind of like if you were to make a butterfly with your hands. We might have done that when we were little. So lay that over your collarbones, and then you can tap alternating your right hand and your left hand. This is called the butterfly hug. And you can do it with your eyes closed and take deep breaths while you're doing this. So what we're doing here is we're using bilateral stimulation, which helps engage both hemispheres of the brain, and neutral sensory touch. So choose to tap in the level of sensation that feels nourishing to you. So that would define it as neutral touch. And this sends messages of safety to the nervous system, inviting it to move toward balance and regulation. So we'll just do this for a few more moments. As you're engaging in this kind of exercise, one of the things that you might start to observe if your nervous system is responding and shifting is you may yawn, your eyes might water, you might notice that you have more saliva production or that your stomach starts gurgling because that rest and digest is kicking in. You may feel sort of a visceral settling, heaviness, lightness, and you may feel absolutely nothing at all because if the nervous system is dysregulated, it can take some time for it to respond to these sorts of things. So if you don't feel something, please do not assume it's not working. That might just mean that your nervous system needs a little bit more support. Okay, and you can drop your hands, and then let's do one more. This is a breathing exercise that can help calm the nervous system. So we'll breathe in for a count of 4, hold for just a couple seconds, and then we'll breathe out for a count of 8. And the way that this helps is the nervous system is invited into that rest and digest calm mode when our exhales are longer than our inhales. So let's go ahead and inhale for 1, 2, 3, 4, hold briefly, and then breathe out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And let's do that one more time. In, 2, 3, 4, hold, and out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now we'll do one more inhale. But after we inhale for 4, we're going to exhale it all out at once in a forceful exhale. So breathe in, 2, 3, 4, pause, and then let the air out all at once. Good. And then oftentimes I'll encourage people to just check in with themselves again, because as we begin to start building that ability to be aware of our nervous system, we can notice when we came into a set of exercises, and then after we've done a few, okay, how did that land with our nervous system? And we might have noticed just little micro shifts. And we're not looking for something earth-shattering. It's just little changes over time that begin to build that resilience in our system. So these types of exercises are just the tip of the iceberg, and I can talk about that a little more, but if you have questions, I'll go ahead and pause here.
So anything experiential with you? Because I feel like you're like, I didn't feel anything. It's kind of what I'm thinking, but I definitely had a different experience, I think.
So I think this is a good conversation. So when we first put our hands over, I spent the entire time looking for my heartbeat and never found it. So for me,
you got to find it.
I was like, put my hands over my heart. Oh no, I don't have a heart. And then, so that was just one, that you think about how the two of us are going to process this exercise. For me, it was,
so I'm going to do it right.
It would take a lot more practice. It would take a lot more work. I don't notice near as much about me as I'm sure you notice about you. And when I did try to notice, I probably looked for the wrong thing, because what I connected was put your hand over your heart. And since I couldn't find my heartbeat, I was, maybe my hand's in the wrong place. And that might not even have been the instruction or what was required. Right. But that's where I went.
What about the tapping?
And then we go to we did this, and
I imagined I'm sitting here imagining, is he trying to do a beat right now to a song? That's what's my brain.
So I was keeping a regular rhythm on purpose. And then she said, make sure it's a neutral tap. And then I'm assessing whether I'm tapping me neutrally or not. Oh, is this too hard or too soft? Or, well, if I didn't notice it to this point, why am I considering it? That is, so I suppose to this point, it's a constant overthink.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your experience. The neat thing is there is a lot of right ways to do this. It's not one right way. So if you put your hand over your heart and you notice your heartbeat, or you don't notice your heartbeat, hey, that's a step toward connecting with your body. So that's a success. It doesn't matter what we observe. It's that we're actually pausing to observe, because if we don't ever stop and notice anything, we will be very dissociated from our bodies. And there's not a certain goalpost that we have to get to in terms of you need to be this amount connected to your body. It's the practice of engaging in it that helps us become aware of and able to support our own regulation.
And I was having like different thoughts. Like when we were doing the tapping, since when people watch this on YouTube, my first thought is, oh my gosh, I look silly with my eyes closed. People are watching me tap myself. And so I had to kind of get over that. And then the next thing is I really, really wanted to yawn. But I was like, I'm not going to yawn on a camera. So I'm like fighting back the yawn and like, oh, what's my face looking like while I'm trying to fight back a yawn? So probably the camera inhibited some of that. But I did immediately feel like the need to like my shoulders drop, and I felt like the need to want to yawn and the spit in my mouth, and then starting to wonder if I was going to have tears, coming out the side of my eye. So I felt, maybe because I am a little more in tune.
I was relieved when she said you don't have to feel anything.
Yeah. For those who are asthmatics out there, you might not make it to the 8 count, because I could not make it to 8 with my little asthmatic lungs, but I was trying really hard.
That was the one thing I was able to do what I felt like was right.
That's funny. Yeah. The nice thing about any of these breathing things, we're all different. So the idea is a longer exhale than an inhale. And so when it's a guided thing, you have to pick a number, but it's not a failure to do it differently. And that's the nice thing about, as we customize and engage with these things. Sometimes we find we actually build the capacity to exhale longer as we do work on our breath. Other times 6 is great, and that's where you stop, and that's okay. So it's really about engaging. I like to think of it like learning a language. You don't expect, if you study Spanish for 4 years and then go spend a couple months in a Spanish speaking country, you don't expect to do it right. In fact, it's the very act of practicing it that helps you learn how. And that's how it is with nervous system regulation. You aren't going to be able to do it right because it's a practice that you're gaining as a skill set, not something that you can master right away or maybe completely ever. It's just a practice.
And I think I remembered, like, from other times, like I had my body cross, like, oh, you're supposed to uncross your legs so you can feel both feet on the ground and sit up straight so you can, so there was a lot of internal dialogue, at first, like when you're starting it. And I think for a lot of people as adults, you're also fighting how silly this is. I shouldn't have to do this. I did have like one internal shame message, like at the beginning when we had our hand over our heart, you said, what's your feeling? And you were like, I was smiling because you were saying, like, you're doing your list, what's for dinner? And I'm like, yep. She's not a psychic. She's just calling it like it is. But then you were like, the internal shame message, like, how are you feeling? I was like, oh, I feel really tired. I'm not getting to bed. I'm overworking. And so like those like internal shame messages, started to come in. And I think, so many of our clients deal with internal shame messages. So I think it's kind of a hazard, a warning here. When you start doing this and you start checking in, you're going to notice some of that shame, and you need to know how to regulate out of that shame and not go down the shame hole. To keep doing the exercise, to keep moving yourself past that, to regulate versus, oh, this feels bad, this feels shameful, I'm going to stop. And you're not doing yourself a service if you're not really practicing and trying to get, really get to the space of practicing regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is those shame messages are there. We're now just bringing them to our awareness. So that's another reason why we can have resistance, or it can feel like things get a little harder before they get better. Because as soon as you turn your attention to something that was numb, it's like when you have pins and needles because you sat on your foot weird, and then it starts to come awake and it hurts. That's what happens when we come out of freeze, or when we start to pay attention. We realize, oh, there is pain here, and my dysregulation was protecting me from feeling that. But the dysregulation is also going to cost me something. So it's worth navigating through that discomfort. It's not that we're creating shame. It's that we're just noticing it now.
And so like what you're saying too, I can't remember who said it. I think it was maybe the Asperger experts. They talked about like polyvagal stuff. So if you run to food or you run to screens, Dr. Wilder would call it a beat. But if you run to those things to numb that pain or numb your anxiety or regulate yourself through a substance or a screen or a video game, when you stop doing that thing, there's that pain again. If you didn't process it or regulate it. So that's how sometimes addictions get formed. Oh, I'll run back to the video game. I'll go grab some more food. I'll go back to watching that thing on television, because just like when you're talking about your foot coming, like it does feel funky and you have to kind of stomp it or whatever, to get it. The same thing happens with our emotional pain. We keep shoving it down. We don't regulate our central nervous system. We run to something temporarily to solve it, to numb it, but it's still there in our body. And then we'll just keep homeostasis again, the pattern. I'll keep running to the thing that's giving me temporary relief, but it's not doing anything to resolve the problem. You're not regulating or resolving anything.
Yeah. And I think we want to have so much compassion for that cycle, because with the lack of understanding, training, knowledge about how to regulate, what are we expecting? Certainly some of those things are more harmful than others, and we absolutely want to hold accountability, but we can at the same time understand how hard it is to navigate some of those emotions, the shame, the chronic ruptures. And without really an alternative, it might make sense that we eat food, because that does help our nervous system regulate. It's just not a long-term healthy way to do it over and over, right? So it's, I think, really good news and really empowering for people to know that there are tools that can help support them for an alternative that's actually solving, not just numbing and pushing off dealing with whatever the discomfort or the pain is.
So before we kind of have you take us to how people can find you, if you're been listening to the show, this all fits into all the wilder stuff that we've talked about, from interactive quieting to self-quieting to gratitude thoughts to all of those things, shalom myself, all of these things, kind of how to regulate your brain, because a dysregulated brain can't really build joy and build relationship when you're dysregulated. So while we used a little bit of wilder language, it totally fits into the neuroscience and the broader things that we've been talking about. Now, you don't do relationship coaching work, but would you work with a man and a woman who are coming to do their own work in their central nervous system? You're not going to touch their relationship as much as like, let's get you regulated and form a individualized approach for you. Is that kind of what you would do with neurodiverse couples?
Absolutely. And I can work with them together about the regulation pieces, but I won't work with them on their marriage or the neurodiversity in their marriage. It would more just be, probably individual work. And there could even be a joint session about how can we support each other's nervous system regulation and just understanding, where each other's coming from. But my work is mostly to help individuals learn about what's going on with their nervous system, the different nervous system states, how to recognize where they're landing and their tendencies, and then how to best support themselves. And I have a simple framework of a 5-step process for them to walk through if they're becoming aware that they're dysregulated. Because again, you can throw a tool here or there, but those are just the tip of the iceberg. And those tools are really, they're minimally helpful. They're helpful. Let's say you're parenting a neurodiverse kiddo and they have a meltdown and it's dysregulating you. You can go in the other room and do a breathing exercise, or they can help you, manage in the face of little stressors. But if you're working from a place of chronic dysregulation, if you have anxiety, chronic illness, ongoing symptoms, like we mentioned, digestive headaches, trouble sleeping, pain, rashes, reactivity to smells, autoimmune, and those kinds of issues, then you're going to want additional nervous system support, because just a tool here and there isn't going to reset your whole baseline and return you to a place of health and well-being. But I also want to say there's hope for getting rid of those symptoms. Don't give up. You don't have to live that way. And I'm living proof of that, because I was in bed a lot for 7 years and I'm not anymore. So there are ways to fully rehab the nervous system so that it's not living in that constant state of reactivity.
So how would people find you? One way they're going to be able to find you is on our website under the referral list. And we also have a blog that Jana has written, but going directly to your site, what's your site?
Yeah, it's Jana, JANAM, as in Mary, Smith.com. So real simple, just my name. And on that site, you can watch some videos where I explain a little bit more about what I do and the course that I offer. And there are some free resources. I have a couple of videos of more of these kinds of exercises where I walk you through them, some guided visualizations to help bring your brain into a calm state. And I have one-on-one coaching. And also there's an app that I've been certified to work with called the NeuroFit app that helps assess your nervous system every day. And then it will populate a couple of exercises that it suggests based on what it's gathering from you, so that you can follow along with an exercise based on what it determines would support you best in that moment.
Well, we thank you so much for being on the show. And all that we've talked about has reminded us of our 2 taglines. One, I see you wrote it down.
I've been thinking of what our tagline was for the last 5 minutes. And I couldn't remember until Jana said the word hope. So when she said that word, there's hope for your future.
And you are not alone on your journey.
Because that's the only one I could remember was the second half.
Okay, so let's do it together. So say it again.
Which one?
The one about hope.
There's hope for your future.
And you're not alone on your journey.